long since I've seen some of you, so thank you. We're going to have a few more folks probably be chiming in, coming in here shortly, so we'll gladly welcome them as they come. But I think if it sounds fair to everyone, it's 2 o'clock, so we might as well get this conversation going. We've got some great perspectives and wonderful people to hear from who are kind enough to give us some time out of their day. So Daniela, you are somewhere back there with the PowerPoint. We'll move that forward and go ahead and share some of the reminders that might be helpful. And the one on the top that I do want to make sure everyone is aware, we are recording this session. Many folks were interested in the conversation, but just couldn't join us at this hour. So please note, we'll be recording and sharing this out to the field at a later time. And if it's helpful for you and your board of directors or other staff members, please use it in a manner that is helpful to you. If you have video, we love to have you engaged, even if you just turn it on for when you're answering questions or chatting with us. And as you'll see here, you can raise your hand within Zoom if you have questions. We also encourage the chat box. I've already posted up the signatories that we're going to be talking about with Affy here, the link to that so that you can get more clarity around what we're talking about. So with that, one more reminder, please feel free to hover over your name and add where you're coming from, state, city, or your community foundation name. And just delighted to see all of you. Thank you. Delighted to see my friend Susan from Affy here. She always enlightens me and educates me and makes me feel whole whenever I hear her speak. And so thank you, Susan. And thanks all of you. And at this time, Kathleen, I believe we are ready to get started. We've got a good majority here in attendance. So Kathleen Enright, our CEO, thanks for also being here and giving us some time to moderate this great conversation. So.
Thank you so much, Brad, and thanks to everyone for being here. Quickly, as we kick off, I want to just thank the other members of the council team who made this possible, particularly Daniela Rodriguez-Ramf. This was done on a pretty tight time frame. And also Michelle Spate from ABFE. Michelle's pictured there. She has been in partnership with us both on this session and other work. Thank you, Michelle. So again, I'm Kathleen Enright. I'm the president of the council, and I'm just thrilled to be with you on this, the fourth of our peer-to-peer conversations with community foundation leaders in partnership with CEONet. This group that I see in front of me that's gathered here of community foundation leaders, all of you either interested in or already responding to these deep-seated racial inequities that permeate most of the symptoms and aspects of most of the systems, and aspects of American society. It's just really thrilling. It's so thrilling to see so many community foundation leaders ready to have this conversation. Particularly the toll that COVID-19 is taking, and also the current approach to policing and criminal justice that both of these are taking on Black people and Black communities. That toll is heavy and undeniable, and so it's taking all of us and our good work to try to turn that tide. So I'm thrilled that we're able to be joined by Susan Taylor Batten, who is the CEO of ABFE, a Philanthropic Partnership for Black Communities. ABFE has long been an essential, critical organization in our sector. And actually, in fact, Susan, y'all are celebrating your 50th anniversary next year, if I am correct.
That's right.
That is amazing. Congratulations both on that important milestone, and more importantly, on your tireless leadership in fighting for racial equality and also advocating for Black communities, both in philanthropy and more broadly.
Thank you, Kathleen. Pleasure to be here.
We are so glad that you're here. We also have a couple folks from within the community philanthropy ranks who signed on to ABFE's statement, which is what we're here to talk about. I've already seen Monique Brunson-Johnson from the Evanston Community Foundation in Illinois, and I believe Deanna James from St. Croix Foundation in the U.S. Virgin Islands is also joining us. So they are both going to talk about how they're enacting some of this call to action in their community foundations, and they'll kick off the fuller discussion with all of you. So thank you to both of you ladies for that willingness.
No, you can't see me. Hello.
Okay, there's Monique. Yes, okay, Monique is still here. So we will get into conversation with both of you soon. Thank you so much. It's too many pages. I mean, it's great. It's 4 pages worth of faces. Got to page through them. So our intention for our time together is to really dig deep and understand what ABFE is suggesting that we need to do as philanthropic institutions to respond to both the racial disparities in COVID-19 and the long-standing racial injustices that exist in many of our systems, to be most supportive of Black people and Black communities. So that's one of our objectives today. And we also want to just lift up the practical insights and actionable steps that we can take on this journey as community foundations. So that's our hope. And, you know, as ABFE's statement so importantly points out, this is work that we need to commit to for the long haul. You do not dismantle centuries worth of injustice with a few grants or token steps. This work is structural and systemic, and so it requires some pretty deep commitment. So I'm excited to talk through how we can get to that. So without any further ado, let's get into this, Susan. I'm just so thrilled to hear from you. So why don't we just start, you know, from the highest level and have you share a bit about the context of your call to action and the content of that statement that you created and joined with 60 plus others to issue.
Sure. Thank you so much, Kathleen and Brad, and to the full team of the council, to my colleagues, Monique and Deanna, and to everybody on the call. I appreciate the opportunity and to get to know you better. We, as Kathleen said, we're going to be 50 next year. ABFE's been in this work for quite some time. Our mission is to promote effective and responsive philanthropy in Black communities. And so we are very much concerned about, you know, the ongoing racial disparities that we see on almost every indicator of well-being, regardless of what we're talking about. And clearly, you know, the disparate sort of impact of the pandemic, of COVID-19, and the issues around police brutality that are so front and center in our world today. So we, like many other philanthropy serving organizations, pivoted to a virtual conference back in April of this year. We had about 400 folks online at our annual conference called Harambe. And usually at that conference, we hold a conversation with foundation CEOs, predominantly Black foundation CEOs, not always all Black, but CEO space, to talk about, you know, the current issues of the day. And clearly, you know, we were all focused on COVID in mid-April. ABFE is based in New York. We were in the epicenter at that time. And, you know, it was just, it's been a rough time for everybody. So we started developing a set of recommendations, specifically, Kathleen, around COVID-19 and the impact that was having on Black communities. And I think it's important to say brown communities as well. And then the spate of killings actually occurred, right? Going back to Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and then ultimately George Floyd. And as we all know, this happened in such rapid fire succession that we were all just, you know, a bit stunned, overwhelmed, and trying to still deal with COVID, right? This pandemic that is changing our lives. And so we had to pivot from setting sort of a call to action around COVID specifically to actually put COVID into a broader context, right? And that broader context is anti-Black racism, right? Again, on every indicator of well-being, whether we're talking health, child welfare, justice, you name it, we see Black communities faring worse than other racial ethnic groups. And so we had to regroup, and this is with the we is a group of, I think we had just over 60 Black foundation CEOs at the time working on this call to action. We had to regroup and pivot and begin talking about the broader issues of anti-Black racism, right? And the platform that we actually ended up sort of disseminating to the field a couple of weeks ago, it starts off with a quote from Representative Ayanna Pressley out of Massachusetts. And she talks about having to manage a pandemic within a pandemic, right? So clearly the first pandemic being COVID-19, but the longstanding pandemic in this country that actually can make people sick being racism, right? So with that frame, we ended up putting out a call to action that's got 10 imperatives, right, for the philanthropic sector. And we were writing specifically to philanthropy, even though we really know philanthropy is about moving big public systems, you know, at the end of the day, and where the real dollars are to address disinvestment in our communities. We were writing specifically to philanthropy. So, you know, there are 10 action items, and just to share with you a few in terms of sort of what's in the document itself, and we can ensure that everybody has it. It starts off with a real sort of urgent plea to increase investments in Black-led organizations in this country, in this moment in time, that really serve to build political power in Black communities and economic power in Black communities. When we say political power, we're really talking about, you know, supporting Black-led organizations that actually are about ensuring that Black communities have voice and can influence policy moving forward, right? Because we are in a time in this country right now where, you know, given the recession, municipal budget cuts are starting to happen, important issues around police reform are happening. And so we want to ensure that those organizations that are about building political power, giving Black communities voice, making sure Black communities are informed, are strong in this moment in time. And then also doubling down and investing in building economic power in Black communities and those Black-led organizations that are about building economic power. So those Black organizations that are about scaling and supporting Black businesses, that are about helping Black people get good paying jobs. Because we all know we went into this pandemic and this recession with a pretty big divide as it relates to a racial wealth divide in this country. And this pandemic is just exacerbating the divide tenfold. I mean, the numbers that are starting to come out now around Black unemployment, you know, are really, really scary. So trying to, again, double down on those Black-led organizations that are investing in economic opportunities and economic power. So that's sort of the, if I had to say the North Star of the call to action, is that we're trying to get more philanthropic organizations to focus in on reversing really some of the patterns of disinvestment as it relates to Black-led groups. And just to clarify, when I say Black-led organizations, I'm talking about organizations that have predominantly Black board, Black staff, and predominantly serve Black communities, right? We think it's really important to build infrastructure, again, for political power and economic power. So that's sort of the North Star of it. But there are other things in the call to action, other very specific action items. We are asking foundations really, and it's an imperative at this point, to push for structural change in this moment. So we're hearing those conversations as it relates to police reform. Like, what are the policies that we think ultimately and intentionally or unintentionally disadvantage Black communities and other communities of color as a group, right? And perhaps advantage white communities as a group. And so when we talk about structural change, we're really talking about policy change, and we're talking about investing in policy change over the long haul. As you mentioned, Kathleen, this isn't work that can be undone in a couple of grant cycles. So structural change is pretty key to the call to action. For foundations that are endowed, there's a sort of a third piece about, you know, using endowments to the fullest capacity as possible, increasing payout, you know, where foundations can, combining grant making with impact investing through MRIs and PRIs and the like. Another sort of important piece of this is centering Black experiences. And so for foundations and donors to work much more in partnership with Black communities around the country to ensure that they are informing policy proposals, philanthropic response strategies, and the like. And then the last I would just lift up, again, just mentioning a few, is that we really think that there's an important role for trustees to play in this moment in time, regardless of the kind of foundation, right, that we're talking about. Trustees really have the opportunity to set policy for foundations, but also really begin to track and monitor spending to Black communities, grant making to Black communities, as well as the longstanding diversity issues that we've always been concerned about in terms of hiring and promotion and the like. So it's a pretty extensive platform, and we now have about 70 Black Foundation CEOs that have signed on, and the work now is really just beginning. We were pretty clear that we wanted this to be a call to action and an agenda and not a statement, because we know that often this is what our sector does, is put out statements when we have these horrendous sort of events in our country. But we are now sort of organizing and looking to unleash the power of our membership. We've got a membership of about 700 around the country to help get traction on the ground regionally around the country on these issues. So it's a high level overview of what's in the call to action.
No, it's so exciting. And yeah, everyone, you got this in the description of the session, and we will send it out again by way of follow-up. So Susan, you know, I'm sure you're starting to see some bright spots, and in the statement I was excited by one of the calls to action, which is to ask philanthropy to be as bold and as inspired by the courage of the protesters. So what does that look like? Are there foundations that are behaving in a inspired and courageous way and taking actions that are also courageous?
Yeah, you know, I think the good news is that there actually has been really good work happening around the country. You know, before COVID, before George Floyd was murdered, trying to take on the hard issues of racial disparities and racial inequity. But when we talk about being courageous and bold at this point, Kathleen, I really think it is about being honest and truthful about this country, right? And what's happened in this country, specifically as it relates to the wealth stripping of Black communities and the pattern of disinvestment by both the public sector, clearly, right? And the private sector, foundations as well. You know, we've got data that helps us understand the extent to which foundations have what we frame as, again, intentionally or unintentionally redlined Black communities and Black-led organizations. So I think, you know, being bold and being courageous in this time is about being honest and truthful about what the data says and what we know about this country, and taking action to reverse those patterns. And so I think there's a lot of good work going on. Again, some of it that predated COVID-19. And, you know, I mentioned to you, Kathleen, and your team before we started, I want to talk a little bit about, specifically about community foundations and where I think there are some bright spots, because I really believe that community foundations are the promise in the sector right now, right? That this audience is going to be extremely important, always has been, but extremely important in terms of helping the sector understand what's possible, as well as the country move, you know, in a progressive manner. Because at this point, I think we have to go hyper-local, right? We've got to get connected to community in a very different way. So a couple of sort of bright spots. And again, we're really excited about the foundation work that's happening to take on the broader issues of racial inequity, as well as those that are investing in infrastructure in Black communities to build economic opportunities and political power. But you know, foundations like the Buffalo Community Foundation comes to mind, and the long-term work that they've been doing to address racial disparities in that region. We actually started this work with Clotilde and our colleagues in Buffalo, probably in 2016, it might have even been 2014, where they now actually have, I think, spun off the Greater Buffalo Racial Equity Roundtable, which is a collaborative of not only foundations in the region, but government, corporations, really taking a hard look at the disparities, particularly as it relates to economic inclusion in the region, and have put together and co-funded a number of workforce development strategies that are really sort of addressing the issues of disparities in unemployment. They've done some amazing work around re-entry and sort of bringing folks back from prison that happen to predominantly be Black, right, in Buffalo, which has a very Black-white population at this point in time, but ensuring that the disparities around workforce as it relates to this marginalized community are addressed intentionally. So Buffalo Community Foundation comes to mind. The East Bay Community Foundation, I think they're one of the shining examples of a foundation, a community foundation in particular, that's taken a really big role in building infrastructure in Black communities. They have an initiative called Ascend for Black-led organizations, and it's now actually a funder collaborative supported by a number of regional funders, but it's hosted by the East Bay Community Foundation. And this is to provide technical assistance as well as grants to Black-led groups that have been anchor organizations, right, in Black communities in the East Bay for quite some time. So East Bay, I think, has a model. Their Ascend initiative is a very strong model about how a community foundation actually can support infrastructure and then get others sort of to buy in and co-invest as well. Seattle Foundation just started a really interesting initiative called the Black Future Co-op Fund. It's something similar. It's focusing very specifically on economic inclusion, but again, looking to invest in those organizations that are about, Black workforce development, scaling Black businesses, Black-led CDFIs, right, that are critically important to economic opportunities for Black people in Seattle. And they've got a new fund that the Community Foundation has now invested in, and again, getting co-funders. So it's another example, and we're watching it closely. And then the last one I would mention that I'm really excited about is the Long Island Community Foundation. I happen to be born and raised in Long Island, New York, and they have started a Long Island Funders Collaborative that's actually going straight at the issues of the racial wealth divide. And again, issues of economic inclusion for Black people. And again, the focus on economic opportunity is so critically important. When we look at the disproportionate sort of numbers in terms of who's been laid off, who's lost their jobs during this pandemic, it's Black people, it's Latinx people in particular, being, in the frontline worker and essential worker sort of positions. And so the Long Island Community Foundation now has a number of businesses as well as other foundations actually contributing to this fund and this, evolving strategy that's about addressing the racial wealth divide, particularly for Black people in Long Island. So there's really good work going on. And I think, again, COVID, the issues around, police accountability that's wakening up folks about what have been some longstanding issues. Really, the work of these organizations are coming into play now, and we got to give them more visibility and support.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, there's so many great bright spots that you're mentioning already from this community, from community philanthropy. Yeah. And I'm looking forward to hear the other bright spots that are represented on this phone call. But Susan, I got another question for you about the structural and systemic nature of this challenge. These are embedded in systems, and it's going to involve policy change. And one of the wonderful things about community foundations is they have broader latitude to advocate and to get engaged in policy. And also they're often in partnerships with local and state governments, and so they have the relationships. So I'm wondering what should they be asking for? What should they be leveraging their voices to change at the local level from a policy perspective?
Yeah, so I just want to reiterate the importance of policy. I think we all know it, but it's central to the call to action that we put out. And we really believe the racial disparities that we see, again, on almost every indicator of well-being are primarily due to the disparate impact of policies, right, on communities of color. So while there are bad people in this country, which is true, I sort of see it as, Kathleen, bad policy actually does far more harm than bad people or biased, or prejudiced people, so to speak. And so the laser focus on policy is critically important. And I think the role for community foundations is great here. In terms of what to ask for, I would clearly, to the extent where possible, this momentum around police reform, right, is something I think that many of us can sort of, log on to, and where possible. And I think there are some real agreements, if you will, right, on both sides of the aisle about what needs to change vis-a-vis, policing generally, things like, banning chokeholds, no-knock warrants, and things like that. And so, first and foremost, I would encourage all of us in the philanthropic sector, community foundations as well, to figure out how to sort of get into and build onto the momentum of the conversations around police reform generally in the country. But I also, think that community foundations have a particular role in helping to connect, again, organizations that are doing the really important policy advocacy work, right, to these discussions around changes in policy. And changes in policy that are going to just, I think, explode over the next couple of months, right? Not moving from police reform to issues around education and schooling. I mean, the issues around, remote schooling and who gets access to what and who's got access to the internet, and policies are going to start to develop around these issues. And I think community foundations being closer to community have a critical role to play in, first and foremost, understanding who those organizations are, but more importantly, ensuring that they are connected in the policy conversation. So that is using, right, the role of community foundations as conveners. That's funding these organizations to ensure that they have capacity to be at the table, given this sort of this huge and changing policy environment that I think we're in right now in this country. So that's one, is making the connections. I also think that community foundations should be asking just about the notion of community engagement, and can support, right, that to happen, support the processes of convening, and specifically the processes of dialogue around policy change with a lens on race and equity, right? So we do a lot of trainings and philanthropic advising at Affy to help funders with some tools apply a lens to their grant making. And there's something called a racial equity impact analysis that we use, right? And it helps policymakers, business leaders, foundations themselves look at their policies and think about the impact it might have on different racial ethnic groups, right? So how might this policy impact Black communities? How might it impact Latinx communities? How might it impact white communities, right? And there are actually some states in this country that do require public racial equity impact analyses when you're moving certain pieces of legislation, those that, for example, have to do with sentencing because of the disparities that we see in sentencing. The state of Iowa, you have to have a public racial equity impact analysis process attached to any policy that you're trying to move at the state level around sentencing. I think foundations, community foundations in particular, can support that process. It's a facilitated process. These things happen in the UK and the like, that really help, local policy officials, state government, be in conversation with those most impacted by the issues. And that's how these things work, right? So community foundations have the relationships with these organizations and can support with the right facilitation, the processes to help people think about what might be the impact of these policies on Black people, what might be the unintended consequences of this policy on Black people, on Latinx policy, I think is a huge role for this community. Yeah.
That's terrific. There's so much work we can do. I didn't know about that Iowa example. That's another thing that people can look at immediately. That's terrific. Well, one final question for you, and then I'm going to bring Monique and Deanna into the conversation. You know, one of your calls to action and one clarion call that many of us are raising up is give more right now, but obviously community foundations have fewer discretionary dollars. So I wonder if you have any advice about how community foundations can activate their DAF holders in this moment in service of Black communities.
Yeah, so I would say, and I'm so curious to hear from our colleagues, Deanna and Monique, because I know they're leading on these issues. You know, there are so many good examples of community foundation leaders who are having, again, those honest and truthful and courageous conversations with their DAF holders around issues of equity. I mean, the work that Fred Blackwell has done, for example, at the San Francisco Foundation, that actually, you know, helped that organization pivot its entire work to address issues of equity. It's a community foundation, and he talks about through blogs and in conversations with him about the discussions that he had with DAF holders around why the San Francisco Foundation needed to be, you know, a key anchor institution to ensure that all people had access to opportunity. Similarly, and this also is in the Bay Area, I think the East Bay Community Foundation, right? When I think about how James Head tells his story, the CEO of East Bay, tells his story about how they changed their mission actually to focus on, you know, producing a more just East Bay, but the conversations that he had to have, the truthful and honest conversations he had to have with his donors about why the focus on equity and economic inclusion for everybody was actually necessary. The examples are out there. So I know peers can share strategies, sort of what worked, what didn't work, to model what needs to happen. I think community foundations, the leadership and staff of community foundations can help build relationships between DAFs and Black and Brown-led organizations. You know, there's an old saying, people give money to people who they know, right? And so part of what's happening is just like this complete missing each other, donors and an organizational nonprofit base in Black communities and Brown communities. And so I think very intentionally figuring out how we build relationships between DAF holders and Black-led organizations is something that community foundations can do, and only community foundations can do, I think, and do well. I think, you know, just educating DAF holders on who's doing well, who's faring well, and who's being left behind, and why, and how. Supporting those conversations with donor advised funds, I think is, you know, a part of this work. I think we are in a really critical moment when it comes to grantmaker education and grantmaker support, and I include DAFs in that to talk about sort of the well-being of all people in the region and what's behind that. And again, building those relationships. I think at the end of the day, Kathleen, we're at a place in this country where, you know, community foundations, and I know so many on this call today, have made the call on the kinds of principles and values that, you know, matter in terms of leading a community philanthropy. And once I think that hard work is done, the good news is that there are so many examples of how community foundations have taken on the work of DAF holders and actually not lose many, and in some instances gained others, right? We're also concerned about the diversity of DAF holders in many cities. So I think there's a lot of work that can be done and a lot of examples that can help make it happen. Yeah.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I think James tells that story. He did lose some, but he gained others, and it's such a differentiation point from the national DAF holders.
Yeah.
That values-based leadership of community philanthropy. Well, gosh, thank you so much, Susan, and we're going to continue this conversation with you and with Monique and with Deanna. I'm hoping that once we get in conversation, all those people's faces will get on the same page, but I'll start with you, Monique. You signed this call to action, and I'm wondering if there was any controversy or any bringing along of your board you needed to do to be able to do that, or if this was something that was just a no-brainer, easy thing to get done.
Absolutely no-brainer. First of all, thank you all for having me on, and I have to tell you, Kathleen, my last name is Jones, not Johnson.
I know. I am so sorry about that.
It's fine. It's a common mistake. But so here's the wonderful thing about working with Affy. I drank the Kool-Aid a long time ago. So if you're engaged with Affy and you're educated about the things that Susan just talked about, when things of this nature come up, they are easy to do and easy to support. So I had already engaged my board on the work that we were doing. Susan had talked about the racial, the trainings that they do. I actually hired ABFE in to do the training for my board on racial equity. So I had already been bringing them along in this conversation. It's absolutely a no-brainer. The idea that, as you spoke to, Kathleen, we don't have much money. We do have to raise money. There's always a consideration of if making this statement affects your donors. And that is a stick in the sand for us. We don't care. What we do care about is making the right statement for the community that we serve. And you have to figure out which one is what you want. When we did make the statement, though, it absolutely opened more doors for donors because they knew where we stood. Mm-hmm. They knew where we stood, and we will take the tenets in that statement, at least half of them actually, and implement them at the foundation moving forward. Some of them we were already working on. So it provided, for my board, I think, an idea of what other foundations across the country and internationally were thinking about this issue, and it made it easier to say, okay, us too. I'll raise my hand, us too. We're not doing it by ourselves.
That's beautiful. And tell me a little bit about both what you've already been enacting in your foundation and what you're ready to get moving on.
Oh my gosh, we're enacting so much. So what we subscribe to is a method of philanthropy that it's community-led. So our grant making is not me making the decisions. We use a full-on community of people who are subject matter experts and also people who are impacted by the issues up in Evanston, which is, of course, just north of Chicago. There is a process that involves voices. So making sure the voices are at the table of the people who are most impacted, and being able to feel valued and valuable. So our grant making is starkly different from a lot of places, even though we don't have much to give. In the last month, we've implemented some of the things that we hope will make, if this comes again, if this wave of a pandemic comes again, will make it so that it's not impacting our Black and Brown communities as much as it did right now when we were scrambling to figure things out. So the beauty of knowing our neighbors is being able to foster that trust so that they're connected tighter. So we've invested into more communications across Evanston. We've invested, or we're currently about to invest in a local marketplace so that our businesses are connected and able to sell on a platform that they weren't able to do before because it was only open to Amazon and Walmart. So things of that nature that are actually impacting our Black and Brown businesses that we saw, and the foundation is able to just, give what is a large sum of money to the community, but not to the foundation, and make this change is awesome. So it's called the Local Evanston Marketplace, I think is what they're calling it. And it is an online purchasing platform. So we're able to do things like that. And the policy that Susan is speaking to, while we can't hire a lobbyist, we would never do that. There are organizations on the ground that have been doing it that need more infusion. They need staff. They need to be able to organize, particularly right now around early childhood funding. That is, of course, hitting our Black and Brown communities, and homelessness issues. So being able to advocate, have those meetings with their legislators in the office, on the Hill, all those places takes money and extra people. And they need to be able to do both. So the foundation is committed to funding some positions in those areas so that, again, we know what's happening and it's not trickling down from federal government, all those things, and impacting our community before we even knew it.
And that's counter-cyclical money, meaning like money when everything else is down, you're pumping it up, which is exactly what folks need.
Absolutely.
That's terrific.
We were able to push out a little over $2.4 million in 6 weeks, which is more than we've done in a year's time in our foundation. But it's been really great.
And remotely, and that is Herculean. Absolutely. Well, Monique Jones, thank you so much. And I'm sorry for messing up your name.
Okay.
Deanna James, thank you so much for being with us all the way from St. Croix. You also, I know, have a long, deep commitment to racial equity in your work. And so just tell me a little bit about the story of signing on to this call to action with your organization and any of the commitments that you want to highlight.
Yes, good afternoon. Thank you for including us. I think about, when I think about this moment, I think about what 2020 at the end of the year, we'll look back and think of who was the hero? And I think of the camera being the hero, because so much of this is about being seen. For those of us who've been doing equity work for a long time, nothing is new to us. None of this, sort of awakening is new to us. And for me personally, living in and serving as a place-based organization in an American colony, the issue of being seen has been like this constant, trial for us. And I just have to thank Affy, Susan and her team, and so many other people that are part of the network at Affy that saw us. We serve differently. And, we talked about, what are the radical things that are being done in philanthropy. And for us, everything about how we work and how we serve is radical because of the fact that we have sort of operated outside of the sphere of, national philanthropy for 30 years. And so, serving a territory that by virtue of us, of where we are and who we are, the fact that we are predominantly Black, and for those people who don't understand our status, which is an ongoing, challenge for us, the status of all of us who sit in American colonies or territories was mandated by Congress, by virtue of the fact that we were predominantly non-white. And so our citizenship is not protected in the same ways our citizenship is sort of an act of Congress. It's not protected by the Constitution. That's been our reality for 100 years. And so how we think about, this whole conversation around equity is sort of, it's part of our DNA. It's ingrained in who we are. Because of where we are. And so, we as an organization, when Susan brought up this idea of crafting this was a no-brainer for us. So much of what is outlined and prioritized in that call is part of who we are and how we work every single day. We have rooted our organization in direct, collaboration with nonprofits from our inception, recognizing that our nonprofits were sort of the closest to the most vulnerable people in our community, and also closest to our potential to overcome the challenges that, vulnerable and at-risk populations have contended with. And so there's nothing new in terms of investing in Black-led organizations for us. It is how it's how we think about our work. It's how it's such a natural, innate part of our organization that we just continue to do more of it. One of the other things we've done is we've really spent a lot of time the last 10 years doing policy analysis, not even like trying to drive policy change, but really trying to understand policy, understand the implications of federal mandates and what impact they have on communities like ours. And so now trying, being able to activate that data that we've collected and the research that we've done around actual policy changes that will directly impact the lives of people living in not just the Virgin Islands, but in all the other territories is a huge part of our agenda moving forward. And then last but not least, just serving as a convener and having difficult conversations. Susan has been, she's sort of a rock star here in the Virgin Islands.
She's a rock star here too.
She's a rock star here because she's helped us. We're a predominantly Black community, and so having a conversation on race seems, counterintuitive, and yet at the same time, it's such an important part of our healing as a community and our advancement. And so Susan has, over the last 3 years, long before George Floyd, helping us to lead this conversation on race. Brad Ward has been part of that conversation for several years, and really doing our part to start this work on grounded in truth, so that we're all working toward the same end. And so there isn't one single priority that is outlined in that call to action that is not directly aligned with who we are as an organization. I'll say one of the things I always hesitate to say it because for 17 years I've been in philanthropy. I get sort of weird looks and people looking at me cross-eyed when I say it, that we made a decision not to build an operating endowment because in a community like this, sitting on $12 million or $20 million or $100 million in a community with such grave needs, did not feel like the ethical decision for our board when we were founded. And I know that sounds great for a community foundation to have done things so radically differently that endowment building has not been a priority. But our commitment has been to reinvesting, and what I say is that we serve as a conduit and not a container of resources. And so our commitment is to ensuring that the resources that we have access to go directly to meeting needs today, not tomorrow. And so that's one of the things that, I questioned when I started at the foundation, our board's wisdom, and now looking back, really see that they were ahead of their times in terms of how they were thinking about supporting their community.
Oh, it's beautiful. I mean, it just sounds like the call to action is already woven in the DNA of who your organization is. And there's so much that we can all learn from your experience. I'm excited to see that analysis of policy that you have just done. Hopefully it's shareable. Well, there are so many questions coming in. I want to get to them. And Monique and Deanna and Susan, you were all game for answering these. So just pipe in, and anyone else on the call, I'm going to ask some questions, and then people just take yourselves off mute if you want to comment yourselves, the speakers or others. Neil from Ann Arbor had a question about, adhering to values and whether or not folks are requiring their their DAF holders to follow the institution's values as a filter for signing on. It looks like I paraphrased him correctly. He's nodding. I guess it's probably Deanna or Monique who might best have a sense of that, or others on the call.
I want to clarify, you mean just our standard, any new DAF holders that are coming in?
Any DAF holders. And I asked for a very specific reason. We're entering values planning over the next 3 months. And I'm trying to figure out the context of whether our DAFs are just going to be set aside as a different set of assets that aren't subject to what our board's deciding is critical to the organization or not.
Oh, so our DAFs, we have very few, I should say, at the foundation. But the standard is, of course, if you sit it for long enough, it doesn't belong to you anymore. It belongs to us. So we want you to use it. But as long as it's not in conflict, I would say that it's not in conflict with the values of our organization. And when we just did strategic planning a few years ago, we did send a notice to our board, our donors, especially DAF holders, that the lens through which we make grants has 4 principles to it. And one of them is we will focus on equity and we will listen first. So there's a set of things there, but it was a conversation. And I have to say that our foundation has 14, 15 DAFs. We're not a big DAF organization, but it didn't present us a problem.
It's interesting. There's an answer also from Francis about how they handled it as well in the chat. I'm going to move on to another question about specifically organizations to fund. I mean, I know that this is a question that I keep getting from members too. So Susan, I bet you get these questions. And this is about funding organizations that support or engaged in increasing political power for Black communities. So where do you direct folks when they ask you that?
Yeah, so we actually, first, we're doing a lot of mapping ourselves and about to put a lot of our stuff online. We've got about 400 Black-led organizations that we call movement organizations, right? These aren't direct service organizations. These organizations are about organizing and civic engagement. And we're about to put them online. But I would say, like right now, there's the Hill Snowden Foundation, which is a regional foundation based in Washington, D.C., has a really good map of Black-led organizations around the country that are into civic engagement and organizing. The Movement for Black Lives Fund at Borealis Philanthropies is another sort of online, tool that you can use. And there are several regional associations I can follow up that have started to do the mapping itself. I think what we really want to encourage is for folks to understand regionally sort of who's in your area, right? Affy doesn't have chapters, but there are regional Blacks in philanthropy groups around the country, right? There's groups like Chicago African Americans in Philanthropy. There's New York Blacks in Philanthropy. Those groups also know they're often connected to the regional association. So I would check with your regional association. If you have giving circles, Black giving circles, or Black donor advised funds, they know who these organizations are in your region as well. And then I would check, the two that come to mind very quickly is the Hill Snowden Foundation Black-led organizing map and the Movement for Black Lives Fund at Borealis Philanthropies. And our mapping project will be on board soon, and we'll make sure to shoot it to the council so Kathleen and Brad can get that out to anybody who's interested. Yeah.
Well, and I know the Movement for Black Lives is attempting to raise 50 million right now nationally that they're funneling down. So that would be a good place for support. And ABFE's also about to launch a campaign for their 50th. So that's another good place for support.
Absolutely.
Other questions, you maybe can't just raise your hand because I can't see you all, but you can just take yourself off mute and make a comment. What inspired you into action, or what questions do you have for Susan or your peer speakers? This is not usually a shy group.
So Kathleen, while we wait for others to raise their hands or get involved, I saw Megan was on here, Megan Jones. I know we've had lots of conversations in this lane. Anything in particular that has inspired you from this conversation that you might want to jump in on or share the work that you've been leading? It's been a culmination effort of a couple of years now that you've been working through.
Sure. Well, it's just good to see everyone. But, I think Monique really talking about centering community voice and decision-making about funding decisions. That's been a big part of our work. And it really has been an evolution, but it showed up in some powerful ways around our COVID relief fund and the committee we put together to make those decisions, which had community leaders, mostly from Black and Brown communities who were from healthcare and businesses and other sectors, just saying, there are going to be a lot of nonprofits you're going to recognize, like the food bank, but there's going to be other things that may not be as apparent on the surface that are going to be really critical. And they've helped us make some really interesting grants that we wouldn't have come to otherwise, or might not have come to us. So I just really appreciated you saying that, Monique. And, for us, some of you have been along this journey with us. We've gone and adopted a new mission that's focused on equity and is explicit that we care about outcomes for people regardless of race, place, or identity. And so the board just adopted that not too long ago after a lot of training. so that's been, has really helped us arrive where we're prepared to respond in this moment, but continue to do training for our staff and our board about what it means to lead in this work, and are kind of transitioning now from a lot of personal work, staff going through seeing whiteness training and white staff, and then Racial Equity Institute training for the board and staff, and follow-up conversations, to now saying, okay, it's great to have strong statements and educating our donors, but we really need to be leaning into policy and changes that will be felt by Black and Brown communities. So that's a skill development for us, to be honest, and we're working on that. Would love to hear other people's experience with developing that internal muscle for staff and board. I think the commitment's there, but sometimes the understanding of what that'll actually take. But I will say, as I can't remember if it was Deanna maybe said, that we had to get to a place where we were comfortable to lose donors over things that matter to us. And I think getting there has just been a lot of comfort now for the staff. We can be clear in our communication, we can be clear in our actions, and it hasn't happened. We haven't lost donors. We've had people yelling at us, but we haven't lost any donors. And in fact, we've gotten new donors that wouldn't have been there. So that's been part of our journey. But I'd love to talk more, to hear more from you all if you've made that transition to sort of responsive grant making into some of this policy work and developing those skills.
And just for everyone's context, I know that Megan is from Chattanooga, Tennessee, so it's geographically important to know where folks are coming from when they're making these shifts. Does anyone have a response to Megan's point? And then we're almost at time. It flew. I'm going to give Susan the final word right after one more comment in response to Megan's point.
I would say, if you haven't done what Megan's done, call her. Because I mean, the truth of it, every foundation is made up differently. And so the dynamics within your board and your staff are quite different. And so you can't just take a boilerplate process and say, do it. You really have to evaluate your processes for what they are and be honest about it. So to Megan's point, I absolutely did. I declined a gift because it came with the instructions of not giving it to basically an immigrant population. That's not the values of our organization. So I kindly called that donor and said I'd be sending her gift back. And my board, of course, stood behind me in that. But you just have to learn those values of your organization. And for us, as I'm looking at the faces across this screen, it's important that you are very clear to your community about how you support not just the movement, but the change. And so before Susan even speaks, I will say, if you are not a member of Affy, you need to be, because you'll get this information from them continuously, and you'll begin to feel more comfortable with the phrasing and the things that need to happen in this process, well beyond when people are tired of it. And that's my fear, that people will get tired of hearing it and will get okay and comfortable again. And I want us to not be there.
Beautifully said, Monique. Well, before I just close this out, finally, Susan.
Yeah, no, Monique actually just did my hard work. Let me say that there is a imperative around shared responsibility in the call to action, right? And that it's not the job of ABFE alone, and we really need the partnerships with all colleagues in the sector. And so we do welcome you to the organization if you're interested in learning more about what we do and getting involved with ABFE. We do have a diverse membership. It's not just about Black folks moving money for Black folks. We would not be doing too well in this sector if we were relying on that. We need colleagues and allies and really focus on shared responsibility in this sector. The other thing I would say is that in closing, again, there's such good sort of work happening in the community foundation field. I do believe you all hold the promise and will help save this country, will help this sector, help this country. Actually, I do think it lies in the hands of community foundations, not the big privates, but the unique role that you all play. And so just encourage you to step into that power. And we're here to support you if you're willing to make that step. So thank you, Kathleen, and thank all of you for your participation here. Yeah.
Of course. Well, Monique Jones, thank you so much. Deanna James, thank you for participating. And Susan Taylor Batten, thank you for your decades of service, your bravery, your leadership, and particularly for being with us today.
Great.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys. Take care.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.